Good afternoon and welcome to this public hearing before the Environmental Rules Board. The petition requests that the board consider whether to require IDEM to start a rulemaking to adopt the 2012 federal recreational water quality criteria. It was presented to the board last fall, and the board really appreciates the fact that the petitioners and the IDEM staff have worked together to get this remote hearing scheduled after delays caused by the COVID pandemic. Today, those members of the board who are able to be with us will hear testimony and may ask questions of the speakers after they have finished. I would ask that those board members who have questions use the hand raising functions in the chat. Those members who cannot attend will be able to watch the hearing when it is posted on the IDEM website. The board will not engage in deliberation on the subject today, but will do so at the next board meeting scheduled for Wednesday, November the 18th. Anyone who wishes to testify today and has not yet signed up to do so should fill out the speaker form. There is a link in the chat for today's call. For those of you who are joining us by telephone only, I will ask for any additional speakers after we hear from those who have signed up. Our host for today's meeting is Ryan Clem. Ryan, do you have any additional instructions for our audience today?
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman Guard. Thanks for joining us, everyone. My name is Ryan Clem, Communications Director for IDEM. All microphones are currently muted. Like the chairwoman said, we'll be taking comments at today's meeting. Please use the speaker form. There's a link in the chat to fill that out, and the chair will be calling on those folks to speak. If you would like to share your screen for a presentation or other materials, just let us know when you're called upon, and you will be able to do that. If you have a question or technical issue during the meeting, you can use the raise hand or the chat feature. And we'll get to you. So to access the raise hand or chat feature, at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on what kind of device you're using, you'll see a menu bar. You may have to move your mouse or touch your screen for that to pop up. In the middle there's a chat icon, which you can click on to show the chat dialog. You should also see the raised hand option there. So please utilize the raised hand or the chat features if you have any questions or comments, and you will be called upon. For those joining by phone, if you have a question or comment, you can also raise your hand by pressing *9, and we will call on you at the appropriate time. When called upon, you will need to unmute your phone by pressing *6. If any members of the media have joined us, please utilize the chat feature or email media@idem.in.gov if you have any questions. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on IDEM's website in the next day or two. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chairwoman Guard.
Thank you, Ryan. Board members were also sent documents that will be discussed or referred to today. Anyone who has additional documentation for the board to consider should forward a copy to the IDEM rules staff after today's hearing so that they can be sent to the board members. I will call on each speaker and give the board the opportunity to ask questions after each speaker is finished. Please remember to mute your microphones until it is your turn to speak. I'm going to call the speakers now, and just remember, if you have questions, board members, you can use the raised hand function in the chat room. Okay, our first presenter today will be Craig Williams.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Guard. My name is Craig Williams, Superintendent of the Wastewater Utility in Angola, Indiana. On behalf of the citizens of Angola, Mishawaka, Rensselaer, Columbia City, Huntington, New Haven, Peru, Butler, Elwood, Richmond, Brownsburg, Speedway, Lafayette, South Bend, and many other communities who are in support of this effort. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I also want to thank Assistant Commissioner King and her staff as they worked so hard to give us the opportunity to provide our testimony to you today during this pandemic. Over the last 20 years, Indiana communities have made historic investments in sanitary sewer, storm sewer, and wastewater treatment improvements to protect public health, improve water quality, and to comply with federal and state requirements to reduce combined sewer overflows. Communities committed to these investments with the understanding that the EPA and IDEM recognized that one of their roles was to review and revise water quality standards to ensure that as CSO long-term control plans were completed, compliance with EPA's CSO policy could be achieved. From the 1994 EPA combined sewer overflow policy, quote, development of the long-term plan should be coordinated with the review and appropriate revision of water quality standards and implementation procedures on CSO impacted waters to ensure that the long-term controls will be sufficient to meet water quality standards, end quote. 7 years later, the following statement about these reviews and revisions of water quality standards was made, quote, in the 7 years since EPA issued the CSO control policy, implementation of this principle has not progressed as quickly as expected. Now, that statement was from the EPA in their 2001 EPA guidance document coordinating CSO long-term control plans with water quality standard reviews. And from that same document, quote, with increased coordination and cooperation and the active participation of all entities in integrating the CSO long-term control planning processes and water quality standards reviews, states should be able to revise water quality standards as appropriate in cases where standards are not attainable, and communities should be able to develop long-term control plans that provide for the attainment of water quality standards, end quote. And certainly, IDEM recognized their part in this from their combined sewer overflow fact sheet dated August 11th, 2008, regarding their roles within the CSO strategy. One of those points was review and revision of the water quality standards during the development of CSO control plans to reflect the site-specific wet weather impacts of CSOs on water usage. And so where we find ourselves today is Indiana communities have developed and implemented or are implementing their CSO long-term control plans with none of the regulatory certainty that was anticipated, actually expected by not only those paying for the CSO controls, but those laying out the requirements some 25 years ago. The EPA recognized that once communities had completed CSO long-term control plans, CSOs would still occur during certain wet weather events. Referencing EPA's own 1994 CSO control policy, then EPA Assistant Commissioner Luana Wilcher asserted that regulatory certainty for affected communities was one of the primary goals of the policy document. Now, she went on to say that the US EPA would not have issued the document if they knew that the water quality standards for CSO discharges were not going to be modified. Obviously, proposing modifications to the water quality standards are counterproductive if they do not protect public health and water quality. From the 2012 recreational water quality fact sheet, and I'm going to paraphrase here for brevity, but the 2012 recreational water quality criteria rely on the latest research and science, including studies that show a link between illness and fecal contamination in recreational waters. The new criteria are designed to protect primary contact recreation, including activities where a high degree of bodily contact with water, immersion, and ingestion are likely, end quote. Now, this wasn't a once time around. The 2012 criteria are subject to EPA review every 5 years. In 2017, the EPA completed a review of the criteria with a focus on the science related to the protection of human health in water designated for primary contact recreation, and found the criteria to be sufficient to protect public health. Furthermore, the EPA contemplated the application of the recreational water quality criteria in what it described as non-continuous or episodic discharges related to CSOs, and clearly anticipated its use to allow compliance to the national CSO policy. As such, we believe that this criteria is an appropriate and defensible vehicle to provide Indiana CSO communities the regulatory certainty that was originally intended and expected in the CSO policy. So today specifically, we are requesting the board direct IDEM to one, assemble a work group whose purpose is to recommend rule language that provides regulatory certainty utilizing the framework of the 2012 recreational water quality criteria. Two, set a specific deadline for IDEM to return to the board with recommended rule language. And finally, include representatives of regulated communities to participate in the work group and rulemaking development. I want to thank you for your time today, and I will be participating throughout this meeting to answer any questions that the board may have. Again, thank you.
I have a question for you. How many communities do you think are in this situation?
My understanding is there are over 100 CSO communities in Indiana.
There, we used to have about 106 when we worked on this.
That number sounds spot on, Chairwoman. I know that, as I understand it, there are 36 communities. I may not have the numbers exactly right, but roughly 36 communities that may be trying to go through the UAA process, which I think you've been introduced to over the last year with Indianapolis and now Fort Wayne. The remainder of the communities, as I understand it, now have language in their permits that CSOs are prohibited discharges and enforcement discretion will be applied. And so those would be the communities that I would think would benefit most from this water quality criteria change.
Do you know if there are any communities that have gone through the process and completed their work under the current statute and rules?
I can speak specifically for the city of Angola. I believe 6 years ago, 5 years ago maybe, we completed a post-construction audit for our CSO long-term control plan. We were found to be in full compliance with that. I know Mayor Hickman is going to speak more specifically to that, but we actually exceeded the level of control that was in our plan substantially. And we still have prohibited discharge language in our permit.
Okay. If there are any other board members, I think Joanne has a question.
I do. Thank you, Chairman Gard. I'm wondering if you could explain to me just a little bit what the regulatory uncertainties are. I'm not exactly sure what's uncertain.
Absolutely. When communities were working with IDEM and EPA in the mid-90s and early 2000s to develop plans to remove combined sewer overflows, the understanding, communities were given the recognizing that systems from community to community were different, that different communities would require different methods to meet the standards. Communities were given the freedom to come up with solutions. How are we going to meet the CSO policy? Now, it's interesting to note that in the 94 policy, two of the thresholds that EPA recommended was an average of 4 CSOs per year, with up to 2 additional CSOs in a year. So you could have 6 as long as your average was 4, or 85% reduction in the volume of CSO total volume. And with the understanding that the community would come up with the solution, they would, IDEM would review it and approve it. The city would implement that plan. And then once the plan was completed, IDEM would do an evaluation to make sure that they had met the level of control, would be the vocabulary that IDEM would use. And if they met that level of control, then if they had a rain event that exceeded that level of control occurred, the community would be protected by what was called force majeure, or act of God. The idea being that they had developed a plan, they had implemented it, and then demonstrated that they could comply with the elements in that plan, and that storm events that were outside that level of control would not be held against the community. Through the development of this long-term control plan process, IDEM, in their defense, through EPA feedback, had to remove force majeure language. And I think that Brady's going to speak to that a little bit. He can speak to that a little bit more thoroughly than I can. But now, instead of saying, well, the community has completed the projects, we acknowledge that they've done what they said they were going to do, and that it meets the level of control, now the community is protected. Instead, we have language that says if you have a CSO, it's a prohibited discharge, no matter how big the storm event, no matter the antecedent conditions. Long answer, and I apologize if that was too long, but I hope that helps clarify things.
Joanne, I think you have to click to take your hand down.
Oh, okay. Thank you for the answer and the instructions.
Is there anyone else that has a board member that has a question? Okay, the next presenter is Mayor David Wood from Mishawaka.
Hi, Madam Chairman, members of the board. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is David A. Wood, Mayor of the City of Mishawaka, Indiana, in Indiana's cool north. I'm appealing today to this Environmental Rules Board to form a work group to develop a new recreational water quality criteria based on the 2012 EPA RQWC, and give this group a deadline to develop new definitive language that will give communities regulatory certainty at the completion of their CSO's long-term control plans. See, Mishawaka's greatest resource, our natural resource, is the St. Joseph River. Indeed, it is why Mishawaka was founded and exists today, and we cherish it. It is the source of much of our economic development, recreation, beauty, and opportunity. Now is the time of the year when thousands of fishermen will converge on Mishawaka from all around the region and across the country to fish for steelhead salmon. Just today, you will see fishermen lining the banks and boats trolling just offshore. We have invested tens of millions of dollars to improve access to the river along our riverfront and our riverfront parks, which are also connected by the Mishawaka River Walk, a nearly 4-mile trail system along the shores of the St. Joe here in Mishawaka. It gets hundreds of thousands of unique uses each and every year, and is a very intimate space with the river. At any given point in time throughout the year, you will see scores of our citizens of all ages strolling, jogging, biking, picnicking, fishing, kayaking, golfing, boating, or just skipping stones. It's an idyllic setting. It's Americana. It wasn't always like that. When I was a child, I was always told not to go near the river. It was too dangerous. It was too dirty. And it was dirty and pretty smelly too. Factories polluted the river, and it was an unattractive place to be, especially downtown. But I was a child of the river. I grew up on it and have never lived more than a mile or two from it. I couldn't resist its lure. It brought me adventure, recreation, peace, food sometimes, certainly some tough lessons, and even a few scars that I carry with me today. But most importantly, the great memories of the countless hours I spent near and on it. In fact, I was just recently I recently completed my 5th St. Joseph River cruise, which is a kayak trip from Mishawaka to Lake Michigan, a 2-day, 60-mile trek with my friends and family. This last trip, I took my 14-year-old son. He was my 4th child to take this trip with me, kind of a rite of passage. Now, the river is altogether different. Since 1990, Mishawaka has made historic investments to reduce combined sewer overflows and their impact on water quality in the St. Joe River. The river divides our downtown and has become a focal point for development, both public and private, in our revitalized central city. Protection of this vital asset is a priority for Mishawaka, and in particular for me. Our efforts have included 2 upgrades at the wastewater treatment plant, separation of combined sewers in selected areas, upsizing sewers to eliminate bottlenecks in sewer system, extensive pipelining to eliminate infiltration, and very aggressive sewer maintenance. The river is as clean now as it has been in my lifetime and in any of our lifetimes. Since 1990, Mishawaka has spent $252 million to achieve a combined sewer overflow capture percentage of 99.54. Again, that's 99.54% capture. Annual CSO volume has been reduced from 314 million gallons to less than 4.1 million gallons in a typical year. Despite these tremendous improvements, Mishawaka continues to invest millions in further infrastructure projects to continue to reduce our CSO volume, increase CSO capture percentage, and revitalize older neighborhoods where most of our city's remaining combined sewer overflows are found. This investment has improved the beautiful St. Joseph River and drastically reduced Mishawaka's impact on the river. The remaining CSOs represent just 0.4% of all the bacteria load to the river, decreased from 5.6% in 2007. As a result, even if we were to totally eliminate our CSOs, spending an additional $160 million, it would not result in a single additional hour of compliance with the current state standards. This is because we have already made the right investments. And while we want the St. Joseph River to be even better than it is today, additional spending on CSO infrastructure cannot get us there. Furthermore, Mishawaka is also facing over $160 million in necessary upgrades to our water and electric infrastructure. With these additional infrastructure needs, non-beneficial spending on CSOs is the wrong investment for our citizens and for our community. To give some human context to it, if the needed improvements to water and electric move forward with the current CSO long-term control plan obligations, 2 of every 5 households, so 40% of our households, would be paying over 10% of their entire income on just 3 utility bills. As Mishawaka gets closer and closer to the end of our CSO long-term control plan, it's becoming increasingly clear that the current means of providing regulatory certainty, the use attainability analysis process, results in uncertainty, wasted time, and increased cost. The UAA process is described in Indiana's non-rule policy document Water-014. This process provides only temporary relief. It must be reauthorized every 5 years. It will require significant effort by IDEM staff, and development of the UAA imposes another cost on each wastewater utility. The UAA must be reviewed and approved by the US EPA and IDEM and the board every 5 years. If a subsequent UAA indicated that ratepayers could afford to spend more on CSO control, based on sewage rates as a percentage of median household income. A community could be forced to spend significant amounts of money on projects that do not create measurable improvement in water quality or public health. But it doesn't have to be this way. The 2012 RWQC was developed by the United States EPA and is based on the newest and best science. The 2012 RWQC was reviewed by the US EPA in 2017, and the 2012 RWQC was found to be protective of public health. EPA developed these criteria to reflect the latest scientific knowledge, public comments, and external peer review. Their criteria are designed to protect the public from exposure to pathogens while recreating and in and on the river. The 2012 RWQC are recommended by EPA to replace their 1986 criteria, which Indiana's water quality standards are currently based on. Other states in Region 5 are adopting these criteria. Ohio has already adopted them, and Wisconsin will soon do so. EPA Region 5 governs Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin, so Indiana would be the only requesting EPA to accept its own standard, which is already approved for other Region 5 states. Federal approval of the updated standards is not a concern. State adoption is needed, and IDEM is resistant to do so. Updating the Indiana water quality standards to mimic EPA standards will provide certainty to Mishawaka and other CSO communities throughout the state. In closing, adoption of the 2012 RWQC will assure that future investments in wastewater infrastructure will not only be wasted on massively expensive projects with no environmental benefit, ignoring other critical infrastructure needs in communities such as Mishawaka. This change would allow Mishawaka and likely many other communities the ability to be in compliance with water quality standards at the completion of their long-term control plans. The significant fact that we would be in compliance with water quality standards would negate the need to do an extensive and time-consuming UAA every 5 years and gives us regulatory certainty that we are done. Regulatory certainty is important for all of Indiana's CSO communities and will prove vital to both promoting a clean environment and providing a much needed stable condition for our continued growth and economic development efforts. And I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. You know, back in, it's been years ago when we did the CSO legislation, we had provision in there, and it passed, it stayed in the bill, to say essentially that municipalities, whoever was doing this project, didn't have to go past the point of diminishing returns. So obviously that hasn't worked.
So it has not worked. We touched on a little bit earlier, Craig did, that you know, just the criteria seems to be different for each community. So we had to negotiate through the EPA, through IDEM, and sign a deal with the United States Department of Justice. So when you look at the community to our west, they are held to a different standard and will never reach what Mishawaka has done. This is the community just right downstream from us. Just right upstream is another community that is held to a different standard than Mishawaka. Mishawaka is held to 0 overflows. The community to our west, I believe, is at 4. The community to the east is somewhere around 9. Both of those communities will, at their termination of their plans, be discharging you know, sewage far exceeding what Mishawaka is by consent decree able to discharge into the river. So it's very subjective and very punitive to communities like Mishawaka. We feel like we are a great actor. We've already done what we've said we were going to do, to the point where we have eliminated 99.5% of all discharge by volume. We're a great actor. We are a role model for all other communities, we believe. And but yet we're still on the hook to spend a couple of $100 million more dollars for absolutely zero impact on river quality.
Well, thank you. Dr. Alexandrovich, do you have a question, or your hand's still up?
I clicked on it, it was lowered and then it got raised and lowered again. I'll try again. But I'll ask a question anyway. That extra 160 million, was that part of your agreed plan, or is that because you're not meeting a current regulation?
It's part of our agreed plan, which we're currently attempting to renegotiate. So we're on the hook now to build a tunnel, a deep tunnel, a 1.5 miles long, some 10, 11 foot diameter, 70 feet below ground. It's for storage and conveyance, but yet we're at 99.5% reduction, and we're on the hook to build this deep tunnel, which most of our citizens won't see, they won't feel, it won't improve their river quality by any bit, and they're going to have to pay an exorbitant amount to build and then to maintain forever. And so it's completely not needed and it won't impact river quality at all, but yet we're still on the hook to build it. That plus many more projects throughout the city.
Any other board member have questions?
Madam Chair, I'd like to follow up on that just a little bit. So if the standards got changed, you would have more tools in your pocketbook to say, we don't need to go on with this $160 million expansion. Is that, or I guess it wouldn't eliminate it because your agreement is a legal agreement. So I'm
right. It's my understanding that we would be at compliance at that point in time. We're not going to, like I said, we're at a point where we cannot physically improve water quality in the St. Joe River at all. We've done the science, we've done the modeling. We cannot improve it further than what it's already been, even if we spend another 160, 200 million, whatever that price tag is. And so, but this would help us, this would go a long way towards giving us a little more certainty. When I think too of the 160 to $200 million of investment, if we were to have to make that, we run a nonprofit utility. Our citizens and our businesses pick up that tab. That means instantly that we're not a competitive community anymore when you compare to maybe some other communities around the region or even in Indiana. If you live in Mishawaka, your utility bill, especially your sewer bill, is going to be way more than you'd have to pay in, say, Carmel or Fishers or places like that. When it comes to attracting business, how likely do you think it would be to attract business to a city where your sewage bill is going to be way higher than it will be in other parts of the state or even the region? Governor Holcomb has done an outstanding job of making Indiana a very competitive state, conducive for growth with things like tax policy. But this one is one that is not conducive for growth. Other states in this area in a region are going in other directions. And this would, I can't imagine that we want to be stricter than the United States EPA. That's not been something that, Indiana typically tries to do, is to be stricter and more regulatory burdensome than even the United States EPA. And so this has real cost, real burden as far as the regulation itself, and will restrict growth, economic development, and again, provide zero improvement to water quality, which is what it's intended to do.
Well, thank you very much. If there are no more questions from board members, I'm going to ask Mayor Richard Hickman from Angola to make his presentation.
Thank you, Chairwoman Guard, and board members. We appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Basically trying to just get certainty for CSO communities like ours on regulation. The story in Angola begins back in 1995 when then Mayor Bill Selman and other city leaders began implementing a plan to remove stormwater from the sanitary sewer system to comply with the new federal state CSO control policies. Our historic expenditures came with expectations that there would be an endpoint. In other words, a time where we met the purpose and intents of the national CSO control policy. And after almost a decade of improvements, in 2004, IDEM approved Angola's CSO long-term control plan, identifying the final list of sewer separation projects that would allow us to fully comply with the CSO control policy using the design storm approach. At the time, we were told that as long as we demonstrated that we could fully capture and provide disinfection to overflows up to the 10-year, 1-hour storm, CSOs that occurred because of storms bigger than that would be covered by a term called force majeure. By the end of 2010, Angola, a community of 8,500 residents, had completed all of the projects identified in his plan at a cost of more than $12 million. Post-construction monitoring and a comprehensive audit conducted by IDEM verified that our efforts had exceeded the desired result. We consistently demonstrated the ability to receive and completely treat flows from the 10-year, 1-hour storm. And it is interesting to note that under Section 4 of the 94 CSO control policy, which has been provided to you, the policy states a program that meets any of the criteria listed below would be presumed to provide an adequate level of control. 1, no more than an average of 4 overflow events per year. 2, the elimination or capture for treatment of no less than 85% by volume of the combined sewage on a system-wide annual average. And on average, Angola has 3 CSO events annually with a median flow of less than 50,000 gallons per event. And our efforts have resulted in a capture of more than 97% of all CSO flows. Then in 2014, IDEM notified Angola that with the completion of our CSO long-term control plan and approved post-construction monitoring audit, the terms of our permit were changing. Combined sewer overflows were now prohibited discharges, and IDEM would use enforcement discretion to determine if we complied with CSO policy. We built up our system as expected by IDEM, demonstrated our ability to meet and substantially exceed the metrics that IDEM and Angola had mutually agreed to in 1995 and again in 2004, and now are faced with what we feel are shifting goalposts. We do not have the regulatory certainty that was expected even by EPA officials when the 1994 CSO policy was developed. Angola sits at the top of the St. Joseph River Basin watershed, which flows to Lake Michigan. We are the county seat of Steuben County, home of 101 lakes and Pokagon State Park. Angola understands the connection between water quality and tourism, public health, and protection of the environment. Angola was one of the very first Indiana communities to complete its CSO long-term control plan. And we firmly believe that every cent of the $12 million spent to address the CSOs was the right investment. Angola street, engineering, stormwater, and wastewater department heads continue to find ways to reduce inflow and infiltration into the sewer system when projects and budgets allow us to. And we continue to look for opportunities to reduce the impact of CSOs in our watershed, even though they are far outside the scope of what was needed to comply with the level of control originally established for us. We believe that IDEM has the tools at hand to provide the much needed regulatory certainty to CSO communities within the framework of the EPA 2012 recreational water quality criteria. And we ask that the board direct IDEM to complete what the EPA and IDEM understood was their part of the CSO control plan, which is to provide Indiana CSO communities regulatory certainty by revising water quality standards to reflect the site-specific wet weather impacts of CSOs on water usage. I thank you for allowing us to testify today and to hear the story of Angola, Indiana, and how we've got to where we're at. Thank you. I'm sorry, you're still muted.
I'm sorry.
That's
I don't see any hands up for questions. Any
Okay.
board members have a question? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. And everybody stay safe in this COVID stuff here.
We're trying. Mayor Stephen Wood from Rensselaer.
Good afternoon, Honorable Chairwoman Guard and members of the Environmental Rules Committee. I am Mayor Stephen Wood of the City of Rensselaer. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Environmental Rules Board and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management on how the 2012 Environmental Protection Agency's recreational water quality criteria would impact our city. Over the last 20 years, Indiana communities have made historic investments to improve water quality by expanding sewer and wastewater treatment infrastructure to significantly reduce combined sewer overflows, CSOs, caused by rain and snow melt. Indiana communities are currently committed to spend over $4 billion to reduce CSOs and protect the environment by completing their existing CSO long-term control plans. The City of Rensselaer is one of over 100 CSO communities. And like most CSO communities, the required CSO long-term control plan represents the largest capital improvements project in history. Since 1992, when the city initiated compliance with the state and federal CSO policy, over $15 million in CSO mitigation projects have been invested. Most recently, in 2017, the city completed the construction of a wet weather CSO treatment facility, whereby over $7 million of the over $15 million was invested in mitigated of a discharge of an untreated CSO. The city is under a state enforcement action and a state agreed judgment to spend an additional $27.8 million through 2030. This brings the total of the CSO wastewater utility improvements to $42.6 million for a community that has a population of 5,878. Not only is the city's consumer base limited when compared with larger utilities, the city utilities, including electric, gas, water, and wastewater, annual revenues have been reduced significantly by approximately $1 million per year due to the suspension of St. Joseph's College that ceased operation in May of 2017. Currently, the average monthly residential customer has a utility bill of over $49 for their wastewater utility a month. The required future CSO and wastewater improvements are projected to drive the average monthly residential wastewater rate in excess of $110 per month by 2030. In the CSO arena, impact on residential customers is a major of wastewater and CSO mitigation cost per medium household income. 2% or greater is considered to be a high burden. On customers, our anticipated impact is over 3%. The 1994 federal CSO control policy states that the CSO mitigation program that results in an average of 4 overflow events per year with a maximum of 6 overflow events is presumed to provide an adequate level of control. This is consistent with the level of control agreed to by Rensselaer and IDEM. And the city continues to implement the long-term control consistent with this agreement. We believe that IDEM has the tools at hand to provide much-needed regulatory certainty to CSO communities within the framework of the 1994 federal CSO policy and the EPA 2012 recreational water quality criteria. This approach will allow Rensselaer and other Indiana communities affirmation that they will not be forced to spend additional resources on CSO infrastructure that provides little to no environmental benefit and gives our communities freedom to make the right investments to protect the public and the environment. Thank you for your time.
Any questions from board members? What is your annual sewer rate?
Our annual sewer rate, I can
I
tell you.
mean, well, your monthly.
Our monthly sewer rate right now at the present is $49, but we just, we're doing this improvement. It's a little over $6 million improvement that we're going to do here very shortly, and our rates are going to go up. In 2021, will be over $50. We're going to have a rate increase. We're putting it in phases, 1 a year, 2 years, another phase, 3 years, another phase. And by the time that's all said and done, it'll be $60, at least $60 a month per average utility, wastewater utility user.
Okay, and after this next project, what percent of the CSOs do you think you'll capture? What will be the total number?
To give you a little history, the city of Rensselaer had 22 CSOs at one time, and now we're down to 8 CSOs. What I mentioned we just built what they call a wet weather treatment plant, and that was $7 million. What it does, it's a big tile that goes in and it captures sanitary and stormwater and treats it, sends it back to the river. So this project we're working on now is to build a new major lift station. The one we had was built in the 60s and we have to replace it. Plus we do have some unsewered areas that was annexed back in 2011 that we're going to provide sewer to. So also our water rates are going to go up to do that project also of another water tower and extension of water too. Also, that's all happening. Plus we have trash pickup. We own our own garbage. And those rates are also going up in 2021. So we just passed all of that maybe about 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. When I was in the Senate, some of the communities that I represented, and this this was about 10 years ago, had sewer bills of over $80 a month.
Yes. But, well, like I say, we're a community of 5,000 and it's hard to spread that out over, probably we only have maybe, we base our sewage bills on the water meter usage, and we probably only have maybe 2,900 meters probably in the community, maybe 3,000. So, and that's hard to balance that over a period of, say, the next 3 years. We're raising our rates by phases in the next 3 years.
Mhm. Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll move on to the next presenter, and thank you very much, Mayor.
Thank you.
The next presenter is Brady Dyer from Commonwealth Engineers.
Good afternoon. I'd like to clarify or step in on Mayor Wood's discussion there. So at the end of the long-term control plan, the rates in the city of Rensselaer are actually anticipated to be about $110 a month, I believe. So that's kind of a little bit more, forward thinking than what was initially indicated in terms of through 2023 or so. So again, my name is Brady Dyer. I'm the compliance manager at Commonwealth Engineers. And a little bit of, I guess, first, thank Chairwoman Guard as well as the Environmental Rules Board and IDEM for having us speak today. There was a time and place in which I too was a CSO manager, and I know that many of the folks out there today listening can relate to these issues that we wrestled with back at that time. One of the issues that I wanted to discuss today has to do with force majeure and as well as enforcement discretion that kind of evolved over time. So basically back when non-rule policy documents were developed and prepared, Craig Williams touched on this, enforcement discretion was basically something that would be granted by the agency when once long-term control plans were basically complete. As things evolved, the EPA was not so fond of that approach. And basically, the EPA required that IDEM basically remove enforcement discretions, and then CSO discharges were basically prohibited. So that was kind of one of the issues that Craig Williams discussed in his testimony, as well as Mayor Hickman, and something that I wanted to get back on topic as well to kind of cover that issue. CSO communities implemented controls. They spent millions of dollars to comply with state and federal long-term control plan requirements. And now we're left with NPDES permits that essentially say that our CSOs are prohibited. So moving forward, I guess the one thing that I wanted to bring forward to the group as well is, we've got communities like Rensselaer. We heard from Mishawaka. We've heard from the city of Angola. But many of these communities have implemented millions to date. And our group, as part of the citizens petition, we believe that through the implementation of the 2012 water quality criteria, that IDEM has the tools in place to provide regulatory certainty to CSO communities. So one of the things that the 2012 criteria allows, and I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit, that I think was something that Ms. Alexandrovich was asking about, was basically how to meet the criteria and what this would mean for long-term CSO compliance control. We believe that, first of all, NPDES permits have basically a 10% exceedance allowance by sample. The 2012 criteria allows for a 10% allowance by sample as well, or in a time frame. And the Citizens Petition Group, we believe that this could be implemented such that CSO communities in the state of Indiana, including Mishawaka, that's under a federal consent decree, the city of Rensselaer, that is under a state agreed judgment that is limited to a number of overflow events per year, as well as Speedway and Angola and a lot of these other communities, whether or not they are to achieve compliance with a particular design storm. We believe that this 2012 criteria could be put in place such that over a time period, which would be 90 days, that we could look at it in terms of a percentage of time versus sample. And at that point in which we would be able to determine compliance with the 2012 water quality criteria. So that's just one of the ways in which our group believes that we can implement this criteria for compliance assurance. We again believe that a work group would be prudent with a deadline to report back to the Environmental Rules Board with potential rule language. Would be a way to provide this regulatory certainty to CSO communities in the state of Indiana. With that, I would like to thank IDEM as well for all the hours that they put into preparing for today and previously in advance of this meeting. I would also like to thank the Environmental Rules Board for the same. I know this can be a time sensitive or time intense process. We really appreciate your time to date, and we would certainly welcome the opportunity to work with you moving forward. Thank you.
What do you think is a reasonable length of time to give the committee to do their work?
You know, in these COVID times, it's kind of hard to say, but we all have adapted by meeting virtually as we are today. I would say anywhere from 6 to 12 months would be an adequate time frame to evaluate that and get a group of folks together that would be able to put some thoughts into place to implement this.
Okay, and yeah, I assume you're aware of how long it takes to get rules through, even amending rules.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're a patient bunch. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Any other questions from board members? Well, thank you very much. And with that, we'll go to Tim Healy from Greeley and Hanson.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Guard. As far as, what I want to speak to today, probably maybe 3 different items: the impact on smaller communities, the impact on the rules board, and then, the return on the investment that we've seen for this work to date. So the board has firsthand experience with the UA for Citizens Energy Group. I think Fort Wayne and some other larger communities might be going that route. So that is a path. That's a path forward. A lot of people put blood, sweat, and tears into it to develop it and get it to where it is today. And it is a path forward. But, for larger communities, they might have the time, the expertise, the staff to track that and have somebody that's on it full time. For smaller communities, and that exact number, maybe it's in the upper 80s, 90s, that could result in a lot of UAAs, and there would essentially not be an end to those. So, say it's 80, 90 communities, and that keeps going forward every 5 years. And I'm not an air guy, I'm a water guy, but as I've been a part of these meetings, it seems like almost all the rule board meetings start with a number of air permits or variances or things that I don't totally understand. And it almost seems like we're setting ourselves up for that exact same thing for water for the next, I don't know, I mean, theoretically it would never end. So every rules board meeting going into the future, we could have 4 or 5 UAAs that need to be reviewed and approved. And I know it wouldn't take as long as the citizens one did the first time through, but that's essentially what we're setting ourselves up for. So that, there's going to be an impact on the rules board. It is a path forward, but I don't think it's is accessible a path forward for the smaller communities. And then if we, just pivot to, how that, what return on investment we've gotten thus far for all this work on CSO. I don't think anybody in this group is saying that we should move backwards. I mean, a lot of these communities had very high levels of CSOs when we started, and we all want that beneficial water quality that Mayor Wood talked about. We all want to keep moving forward. But I guess our argument is that once you get to the end of these long-term control plans, spending much of any more funding on CSO improvements would not be the right investment. We're going to look at some 303D data in just a second, but I think actually, Chairwoman Guard, you spoke to this early on when you talked about, most of these go to that knee of the curve or that point of diminishing return.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, when these long-term control plans are complete, we will have made the smart investments. So the only investments that are left are the horrible ones that are going to give us even less return on water quality than the first ones that were made. So with that being said, in advance of this meeting, we took a look at some of the 303D list data for bacterial impairments and looked at, where were we in 2016 versus where are we in 2020? And just, zooming in on the White River, just because there are a number of CSO communities that impact that river. Over that 4-year period, the number of miles that were impacted decreased by 24. So, we got 24 miles off that list. But then if you look at, and I don't know all the communities, but if it's Citizens, Anderson has a big long-term control plan, Muncie has a large plan, a number of other communities. So Citizens spends on average about $150 million a year. With Anderson, Muncie, and others, it's safe to say we're spending in the range of, $700 million over that 4-year period. And we got 24 miles off the list. There are more than 24,000 miles of impaired waterways in our state. So if you keep the same unit cost, that would say that we would need to spend $700 billion to get all those rivers and streams off the 303D list if CSO was the culprit there. Obviously that is entirely unaffordable. That would cripple communities. It would destroy the economic advantage that we have. And we could continue to do that, but it would just be totally the wrong investment. The cities and towns that are a part of this group, they've agreed to goals. They want to hit those goals. They want to move forwards, not backwards. But when they've done what they promised to do, they want to make sure that the state is focused on the investments that could be made moving forward that would actually result in water quality compliance. I think, as others have said, it's not often that we're beating the drum of adopt EPA's newest rule, but it's a rule EPA approved in 2012. Again, 5 years later, they've got people that are smarter than us doing the statistics to say that it's the latest in best science. and other states are using this as a path forward. And we feel like this could be a better path forward for Indiana. And we'd like you and the board to consider this in the motions that are before you. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any board members have questions? Okay, with that, we'll have Karen Fahey. I'm not pronouncing that well, but then thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Chair Guard, Commissioner Piggott, members of IDEM and the Environmental Rules Board for this opportunity to speak today on this extremely important issue on behalf of City of South Bend. I am not Karen Fahey. Karen got called away for an emergency. I'm Eric Horvath, the Public Works Director for City of South Bend, and will be speaking on his behalf. So again, the City of South Bend joins communities across the state to urge the Environmental Rules Board to grant their petition seeking to have IDEM adopt EPA's 2012 recreational water quality criteria for bacteria. Communities with combined sewer systems statewide are implementing the largest public works projects programs in the community's histories to control these combined sewer overflows. Having appropriate regulatory standards, which are technically and financially feasible to address these massive public investments, is imperative to ensure continued public support for these programs. Through the city's Smart Sewer program, South Bend has eliminated the discharge of over 1 billion gallons of combined sewer overflow each year since 2008. Our reduction success is significantly ahead of that contemplated in our approved long-term control plan. Through the implementation of the city's smarter alternative for a greener environment, our SAGE plan, as we call it, we will build on our past success and achieve an exceptionally high level of control. Less than 1 million gallons of untreated overflow in a typical year, from a baseline of approximately 2 billion gallons a year. Let me say that again, less than 1 million gallons of untreated overflow in a typical year from a baseline of approximately 2 billion gallons per year. Like you've heard from the CSO communities across the state, our progress has necessitated significant sewer rate burdens on our citizens. And that was before taking COVID-19 impacts into consideration. Implementation of the SAGE program will require further sewer rate increases over the next decade or longer. In order to win public support for SAGE plan funding, we need to continue our successful program of implementation, but we also need to have regulatory certainty that these massive infrastructure investments will satisfy regulatory requirements. Accordingly, we urge the board to grant our joint petition and seek to have the department adopt EPA's 2012 recreational water quality criteria for bacteria in an appropriate manner. More specifically, we urge the department to follow Virginia's 2019 adoption of these EPA criteria. We think Virginia's EPA approved approach strikes the right balance in terms of adopting EPA's 90-day geometric mean criteria as an in-stream water quality standard, while requiring that point sources meet a more stringent 30-day geometric mean at the end of pipe. We particularly support the provision which authorizes alternative permitting requirements, which is consistent with approved CSO LTCPs for CSO communities. We will include Virginia's provisions in our written response to the board. Residual CSO discharges will likely only occur during a handful of the largest storm events during the typical year. During these events, CSO receiving waters will experience significantly high flows, which make them unsuitable for primary contact recreation for a number of reasons, such as being unsafe to recreate. The actual in-stream benefits from further control of these residual discharges is de minimis, as you've heard from other communities. Public dollars are far better invested in integrated planning that will likely yield much higher return on investment opportunities for stormwater, green infrastructure, street and basement flooding, drinking water, source water protection, air quality, climate change, and a host of other community environmental and health needs. We believe it's incumbent on IDEM to authorize such LTCP-approved residual discharges at least until a TMDL is developed for the receiving stream for pollutants of concern. Such TMDLs would implement the 90-day water quality bacteria criteria, which should accommodate residual CSO discharges pursuant to approved LTCPs. Again, I want to thank IDEM for its continued support for the city's program and our sister cities programs statewide. Collectively, we have achieved a nationally leading level of control of CSO discharges. It is time to ensure IDEM's regulations provide both regulatory flexibility and certainty available under the federal and state regulatory programs. Thank you so much for considering our comments.
Thank you very much. Board members have any questions? Thank you. We'll now hear from Martha Clark Metler from the IDEM staff.
Yes, thank you, Senator Gard and other members of the board for listening to the agency's perspective on this. I also wanted to thank the petitioners and acknowledge that we certainly understand their concerns with the expense of CSO long-term control plan implementation. And we as an agency frequently acknowledge the improvements made as one of our big success stories of working with partnership with you all. However, I wanted to present our concern as an agency that the concept of adopting the 2012 recommended criteria may not be the solution that the petitioners are looking for. And I'm going to try to share my screen so that I can do a PowerPoint. So you should be able to see that now.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't want to go into slideshow mode. There we go. All right. I don't know what you all are seeing on your screen. It's not acting like a slideshow for me. So there we go. So I'm just going to start with some basics and work our way through. So a reminder that the goal of the Clean Water Act is to attain fishable and swimmable waters in all the waters of the state. Oops. Doesn't work quite the same. So the components of the water quality standards are to establish our designated uses and to establish both numeric and narrative criteria to protect those designated uses and to utilize anti-degradation, which is to protect our existing water quality and maintain high quality water in all of our waters. And as a reminder for some of you who may not remember, in Indiana, we've designated all of our waters as high quality waters. And just a note that any of our water quality standard changes have to be approved by EPA. So in terms of the designated use for recreation, we designate all of our waters for full body contact recreation, with the exception of the wet weather limited use that's afforded by establishing a UAA related to this very topic. A reminder of how we use the water quality standards. We do that for assessment, which we've talked about 303D list a little bit, to establish wastewater treatment requirements, which is where CSOs come in, and establish effluent limits that would apply during the recreational season. Just a refresher on what the current standard is geometric mean of 125 over a 30-day period and a single sample max of 235. The recommended criteria established in 2012 by EPA for focusing on this freshwater criteria with the illness rate of 36 illnesses per 1,000 primary contact recreators. So you can see that the geometric mean is essentially the same. It's 126, but they've introduced this concept of a statistical threshold value, which Brady was referencing in his presentation. And that's where they would allow, along with meeting the geometric mean, an opportunity to meet that statistical threshold value, which does allow you to dismiss 10% of the samples that you've collected. And that's a key point, that it is based on samples collected, and as far as the agency perceives it, that concept of calculating it based on time is not what is in the recommendation. So the statistical threshold value approximates the 90th percentile of water quality distribution and is intended to be a value that should not be exceeded by more than 10% of the samples taken. And so when you develop a standard, you need to develop the magnitude, the duration, and the frequency of how that would be applied. So the magnitude is that geometric mean. Everyone's really used to that one. And then also the statistical threshold value, which we'll note is regardless of the sample size. The frequency, which has also been discussed kind of briefly, some suggestions that we look at a frequency of the number of violations per that period. The recommendation speaks to a 30-day interval, but others have suggested that 90-day might be appropriate. The only concern with that is that because there's E. coli fluctuates greatly, you could mask spikes that might be during a critical recreation time for citizens of Indiana. Again, I don't think anyone is denying the fact that CSOs are covered under NPDES, and part of our obligation as the agency that issues the NPDES is that these permits control all pollutants which will cause or have the reasonable potential to cause or contribute to an excursion above a water quality standard. This was also referenced in one of the earlier presentations, but wanted to point it out here. When EPA speaks to this coordination of water quality standards and the long-term control plans, the tool that they recognize in their policy is the use attainability analysis. The fact that many of the board members are familiar with is that once you've completed your long-term control plan and you still have discharges, this use attainability analysis allows us to establish that wet weather limited use, which essentially suspends the water quality standards in certain parts of the stream for a period not beyond 72 days after excessive rain event. So some of the key points we wanted to make as an agency is that the current criteria and the 2012 recommendation are both in-stream criteria that provide similar levels of protection, with a 30-day geometric mean of 125 versus 126. Untreated CSOs do cause and contribute to high in-stream levels of E. coli. When samples are analyzed and the results are too numerous to count, we can conservatively estimate that those have between 60,000 and 70,000 colonies of E. coli forming colonies, for lack of a better word. The statistical threshold value is applied to the number of samples, not an estimated percent of time of a CSO. And so 90% of the representative in-stream samples must be below that 410 number to demonstrate compliance. And that's one of the challenges we've had in our discussions with petitioners and other interested parties, is understanding how with a CSO discharge that we would be able to meet that 410. Even with a longer duration, it would be difficult to meet that 410 when we're talking about untreated CSOs. When we added the 10% exclusion for wastewater treatment plants, that is based on treated discharges, and some of the CSOs are would still be untreated, and that's where the real concern is. A longer duration than the 30-day may miss certain spikes and therefore be less protective of the designated use when you're thinking about the designated use as being appropriate for recreation, so swimming. In answer to one of the questions earlier, we put together these summaries. So we have 109 CSO communities in Indiana. 18 have determined that they will be full separation communities, so they would have no overflows and their water quality criteria would be met. We have 28 events per year and percent capture communities. The long-term control plans consider the high cost of limiting all CSOs and recognizes some limited number of overflows, and that's where the use attainability analysis option comes into play. The rest are the 63 design storm communities and the more medium-sized, smaller communities, which are based on, they base their long-term control plans on establishing a treatment of the 10-year 1-hour storm. And so while we understand there are going to be storms greater than that that may result in CSOs, this is where our exercising of our enforcement discretion comes into play. I would argue that the agency has a long history of using common sense to apply enforcement discretion. We do that when we're evaluating sanitary sewer overflows. So I understand that doesn't give the same level of comfort and certainty that the communities are looking for. But I will say that we have a pretty good track record of applying it. There's been some mention of our other Region 5 states that have adopted the 2012 criteria. I have spoken to representatives there, and they had other reasons for adopting their criteria. Some of them had some outdated, they were based on fecal and some other things. So their motivation for doing that was not in the context of CSO, and the people that I have talked to haven't really even thought about how they would evaluate compliance with CSOs and long-term control plans in context of the 2012 criteria. I will say that Indiana is a leader in this area. The fact that we do have the wet weather limited use option, and while it's admittedly can be a cumbersome process, the UAA that does provide more certainty, and that's in the context of the CSO policy that EPA has put forth. I think we're held out as an example for other states to mirror. So I just wanted to make that point as I end. So I can leave this up in case you want me to go back, or I can stop sharing, either way.
Just leave it up for a minute.
Okay.
Are there any questions from board members?
Chair Guard.
Yes.
Craig Williams asked to speak if he could. He couldn't find the raise hand feature, but he asked to speak on the 303D list.
Okay. Mr. Williams, you want to go ahead now?
Yes, thank you. I have two comments. One, I want to go back to the July 8th Environmental Rules Board hearing when I believe Jody Arthur presented the 303D list. And one of the things that she said in her her comments was that she's been at this job for 15 years. And there have been no changes at the top causes of impairment over time. That table never changes other than the numbers in each cycle. And I wanted to make sure I didn't take that out of context. And so I actually reviewed the PowerPoint presentation that she provided the board at that meeting. And on the second to last page, the first bullet point on the key takeaways, that there were no major changes in the number of types of impairments IDEM is seeing. And I want to put that in context, I think, to what Tim had discussed, Tim Healy had brought up, is when we relate it to the intents for the CSO control policy, one of the primary concerns was recreation because of bacteria, high levels of bacteria that can be associated with CSO discharges. Indiana communities over the last 20 years, and now there are still projects being completed, as we heard Mayor Wood of Rensselaer mention, and Mishawaka, and we know other communities are still making improvements. But our understanding is the current level of expenditures by Indiana communities is estimated to be around $4 billion. I don't have a sense of where, if you were to say all 109 CSO communities, what percentage of completion the sum total is at. But when we talk about $4 billion of improvements, but an acknowledgement that over the last 15 years, there have been no changes to water quality, that makes me, as a water quality professional, question where the cause of impairments are at. Are they actually from CSO discharges? Certainly those contribute, but if $4 billion of improvements have been made to capture and treat and remove CSO discharges from Indiana streams and rivers, and there is effectively no net difference, we may need to be looking at other places. I'd also like to thank Martha for her presentation. She mentioned that UAAs were the method that the 2012 criteria will be applied, and I don't believe that's entirely true. The 2012 criteria say that UAA could be a pathway to apply that criteria. I think that there are still places where we may be able to use the structure of the 2012 criteria to come to a solution. That's all I have at this point. Thank you, Senator Gard.
Well, thank you very much. Any other board questions?
Yes, Chairman Gard, this is Joanne Alexandrovich.
Yes.
Yeah. Martha, in the beginning of your presentation, you said that the adoption of these standards might not be the solution the petitioners are looking for. Sounds a little bit like Obi-Wan, but that's just a joke, nothing critical.
I'm a
But
Star Wars fan, that's good.
I'm wondering if you do have, if this agency has perhaps the solution that they might be looking for that's different than this, rather than just status quo.
I know that we have worked really hard to get a better understanding of what EPA will accept and won't accept in terms of trying to establish when CSO communities are done and whether they can call their long-term control plan complete after implementation. And that's where our challenge is, that EPA is still focused, the CSO policy, everything around that is about meeting water quality standards. And so part of their reluctance is not knowing what the future might bring in terms of advanced treatment options or other avenues. And so they're very reluctant to say that you would be done if you're not meeting water quality standards. So I can't say that we have another solution. We certainly have been open to many discussions of trying to figure out that right balance of investment looking at that knee of the curve type analysis, understanding there are changes in the economics of the cities and towns to be considered over time. You know, some of it, the plans that I understood, you know, as they were being developed years ago, weren't able to estimate the cost because costs increase over time as when you planned it 20 years ago and now you're implementing it. So there's all those kind of issues that we definitely try to work with the cities and towns on as they're developing their and adjusting their long-term control plans. But to say there's a clear answer that would resolve and say, okay, everybody's done with their long-term control plans, I don't know that there is one.
Does that answer your question, Dr. Alexandrovich?
I think it does. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Martha, very much for your presentation. The next presenter will be Indra Frank, Dr. Indra Frank.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the Environmental Rules Board. My name is Indra Frank, and I am a physician specialized in environmental health. I currently serve as the Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy for the Hoosier Environmental Council. The Hoosier Environmental Council is an Indiana not-for-profit founded in 1983 to work for a cleaner, healthier environment and sustainable economy for our state. We've heard a lot of very interesting discussion today, and I wanted to offer my thanks to the Rules Board and to Chair Gard for hearing this important issue. I also wanted to extend thank yous to all of the communities that have worked so hard to control their sewer overflows. During my training in environmental health and public health, we studied some of the history of public health, and getting control of sewage, while it sounds very, very mundane and banal, in fact was one of the biggest, had one of the biggest impacts on public health that you know, industrialized nations have seen. The sanitary movement started in the mid-1800s, and there was just a massive decrease in infectious disease as a result over the decades that followed. So every time we control a release of untreated sewage, it's a good thing. It sounds like this topic needs a lot more discussion. I would like to second the written comments that were submitted by the White River Alliance. I think they do a good job of adding some additional points. And I look forward to the discussion coming up. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alexandrovich, do you have any questions for Dr. Frank?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. We have, I don't think we have any more presenters. Is there anyone that did not sign up that's in the audience that would like to make a short presentation?
And Madam Chair, I'll just remind those on the phone, you'll need to press *6 to unmute yourself, and you should be able to speak after pressing *6.
Is there anyone?
Chair Gard, Craig Williams also said if he could make brief comments.
Yes. Mhm.
Thank you. One thing we talk about regulatory certainty, and I know we've sort of gone around on this. I know that some communities with completed CSO long-term control plans and post-construction monitoring audits are now getting negative comments on their CSOs during annual inspections. Inspectors are trying to measure compliance with CSO policy, but are using terminology and standards that are inconsistent with the level of control that were used to meet the CSO policy. Really puts the inspectors at a disadvantage because each community has implemented facility or community specific pathway to compliance. It makes it very difficult for a inspector to come in and understand all of the intricacies that that community's CSO long-term control plan takes. Our concerns about this is only 5 years in after post-construction monitoring, and we have a very good working relationship with Bruno and Martha and the rest of the staff in the Office of Water Quality, and we look forward to continuing having that good relationship. I don't have any concerns about the current staff. Our concerns is, as it stands, the level of compliance is a subjective method, and Martha even alluded to that a little bit in her comments, as far as there may still be some technologies, or there may still be some areas that EPA wants communities to try. Our position on this is, we 20 years ago committed to a path to comply with CSO policy. That 94 policy manual initially said on average 4 CSOs, 6 on a peak year. It said 85% CSO capture. Mayor Wood of Mishawaka has testified in excess of 99% removal of CSOs. South Bend has talked about their superb CSO reduction. Angola, we're above 97%. We have done the things that we as communities said we were going to do. We've demonstrated that, but we are still being subjected to a subjective level of control as opposed to an objective level of control. And that's where we're really concerned about. Certainly, IDEM, Office of Water Quality, under Commissioner Piggott's guidance, has worked with communities and helped develop the success that Indiana is, the gem that it is compared to other states nationwide. But Commissioner Piggott may retire one day. I would assume you want to retire someday. Is that no? Okay. I don't know what the next commissioner is going to bring, or the next governor is going to desire under his executive authority, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. We feel that we're in a very good position right now, but we need to make sure that moving forward, communities have the regulatory certainty that the things we've done, the things that IDEM has said, yes, you've completed, you've met your level of control, stick and provide us that regulatory certainty that we can put this challenge behind us and look forward to the next challenges ahead. And with that, I'll shut my mouth, Chairwoman Gard. I appreciate your willingness to tolerate me.
Well, thank you for your presentation and your information. Any board members have anything to say? Is there anybody in the queue waiting? Ryan?
Brady Dyer, I don't know if he still has a comment about enforcement discretion. I apologize if I missed him. I'm not sure if he still would like to comment or not.
Thank you. Craig covered what I had to say. I guess, coming from a perspective as someone who was a CSO manager at some point, I know it can be subjective. I certainly trust that at Commonwealth, our CSO clients will get a fair shake, when it comes to a level of control audit. But as Craig, just wanted to echo those points, these folks will move on and retire one day. And I think we need something that gives us more assurance in the long run. And we appreciate everyone at OWQ and the Office of Legal Counsel's cooperation to date to allow us to speak on this. The one question that I do have is Dr. Frank had indicated that the White River Alliance had submitted some comments. Is that going to be posted, or is it already posted on the IDEM website for the citizens petition? Maybe I missed that.
I haven't seen it yet either, but it will be made available.
Thank you.
Ryan, anything else?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I don't see anyone else.
Okay, well, with that, we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting in just a couple of things. At the November the 18th meeting, the board will be discussing this and discussing next steps. Consider your suggestion that you would like to have a commission or committee look at this. So we will be talking about that as well. Generally speaking, these things go toward the end of the agenda. And so you might want to take that into consideration. Haven't seen the agenda yet. We don't know how, at least I don't know how long it's going to be. The meeting will be, but we will be considering your petition at that point. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone that was a presenter and everyone that in the audience that was here today, and we will adjourn the meeting.